Thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us. So today's session on benchmarking, we're going to look at a number of different aspects to benchmarking. I must admit, during my career, if I look back sort of 10, 15 years, I guess my understanding of benchmarking was a lot more sort of fundamental than what I know about it now, in terms of what comprises it and how to sustain any changes that come from it. So look, just moving on, the session is, of course, around workplace health and safety benchmarking. We're going to run through a number of different sections for this particular session. We'll have a look at the what and the who around benchmarking. We'll have a look at why organisations decide to benchmark, which is quite interesting. And then there's a little piece on how to benchmark as well in terms of the general process. KPIs, I think we all know a lot about KPIs, and that's a very interesting aspect as well, because often we rely on quantitative measures to benchmark against other organisations, and not all KPIs were created equal. So we'll have a bit of a look at that, and then we'll talk next steps. So that's the outline for the session this morning. First up, I think Sarah mentioned, I'd like to kick off with a poll if that's possible. Just to gauge some feedback on the following question, and that is, does your organisation report on health and safety external benchmarks to the board or senior management, yes or no? So if you can respond to that, and let us know what happens in your organisation.
Thank you, Adam. Just giving that a few more seconds. It's always like watching a race.
It is.
Okay, I'll end that now and show those results.
Okay, so a bit of a spread there. That's interesting. I might turn to Luke now. Luke, you've got experience across multiple industries in leadership roles. What sort of benchmarking have you used previously within your career?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. I think to your point before, Adam, been a bit ad hoc. So, you look at all organisations and what they report. So, a lot of boards in my experience have asked for, the historic TRIFR type numbers and benchmarking that, because that's a fairly common measure across different businesses and across the industry. However, as you said, they're not all created equal. So I don't think it's the best measure, because different organizations use different definitions and different ways of collecting that data. So, but yeah, primarily my history is really based on benchmarking against annual reports and numbers that do link organizations together. But yeah, really limited to that. It's more recently that we've gone into the qualitative type benchmarking activities. So really to get the pulse of the organization. And I've done a number of culture surveys in the past and health and safety surveys in the past, but never ones that really did great benchmarking. So, more recently we used the health and safety index to help us with that process, and in terms of really getting benchmarked information on our qualitative side of things. So look, my experience is basically around that, but yeah, there's pros and cons to all of it, really.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting that you say that you sort of move from quantitative measures to qualitative sort of later in your career as you sort of discovered more. Right, that's great. Thanks, Luke. Look, I might just move on to the next aspect of the presentation, and that is one of the factors of sort of who and what. And I guess there's a number of different dimensions to benchmarking, and some of these I think are going to be fairly obvious and self-explanatory. There's internal benchmarking, which seeks to compare departments or areas within one's own organisation. I think many of us are probably been aware of that. Drives competition and performance internally. There's industry benchmarking, where a partner might not be a direct competitor but share similar industry aspects. There are comparisons around competition. Indeed, you might see that with various products across various industry sectors. And then there's generic benchmarking, which seeks to compare, processes and practices, regardless of the industry or the field of the partner. And the partner is a very interesting term, and we'll explore that a little bit later, because as you'll discover, and you may already be aware of this, the partnering aspect of benchmarking is a very, very important aspect in terms of driving, I guess, sustainable change and even accountability within your own benchmarking activities. In terms of the what with benchmarking, well, again, some of this may be self-explanatory, and I've lifted some of this from a study from Bogan and English, and that was a '94 study. So it's a little bit dated, but I think some of this still resonates or rings true. There's strategic, benchmarking, which is around how companies compete together. We've got performance, which compares product or service performance, and that might be largely quantitative in terms of measures or metrics, I should say. And then 4P, so around discrete processes, places, plant, or people. These are very important considerations, as you'll discover, and as many of you may be aware who have undertaken benchmarking. You sort of need to know a little bit about what you're going to be undertaking and what you want to measure before you embark on that journey. And I might just pause here a minute as well, and might just turn to Luke again. Luke, in your time, has there been any particular catalyst for benchmarking that set you off on the journey?
Look, I think if we talk historically, it's been sort of the board sort of wants to look at, how do we compare to others? So what is, where do we sit and where do we sort of play? So, and if we start in my early days, it was very much around those qualitative numbers, again, it was the TRIFR, how do we compare against other organizations? I think as safety has evolved over time, we're starting to see a lot more of the quantitative data coming in, and boards in particular are really wanting to see how the culture compares. So how does a health and safety culture compare with other organizations? And I think that's a really positive step forward. So, a lot of the catalyst is, some of the catalyst is from boards, but I think more importantly, it's from the people within the organization. So, and as a safety professional, we want to know as well where we sit within the organization, and more importantly is what can we do to improve? So, are we able to identify any of those improvement opportunities to make it a better place and make it a safer place? So,
yeah, yep. Thanks for that. Now, I might just turn to those on the call or the webinar. Actually, if you'd like to drop some feelings in the chat about what sort of catalyst has led you to embark on a benchmarking journey, it'd be interesting to have a look at some of those responses. I found this definition, and look, while it's a little bit wordy, I think there's a bit in it, and I found it kind of worthwhile, and it did resonate with me a little bit. So bear with me, please, as I sort of read the essence of this out. I've lifted it from the reference you can see below, but I think Luke touched on something really, really important, and I think around benchmarking, the catalyst a lot of the time is wanting to be better, not resting on your laurels and having a bit of that chronic unease. And benchmarking does help create a learning organisation. And I think you've got to be open to constructive feedback as well. And it involves a group of dedicated individuals who are pursuing excellence, growth, and knowledge. This definition goes on to describe experts that can quickly learn and master the environments, and how it will be a competitive advantage, I think, into the 21st century. The second paragraph there, I think, has got something in it which I think is really, really important with any change to do with workplace health and safety, be it through benchmarking or other sort of means. But objective information can help trigger a transformation to continual improvement philosophy. But the next piece is the bit that gets me, and that's around the continually reapplying and reinforcing it, because I think we've all been in organisations before where there's a rush to change, and there's a new flavour of the month or the week, if you like, and then it dies a death because the organisation hasn't configured itself to maximise on that change and reinforce it in the way that it operates. So benchmarking indeed does set a framework for excellence, but ultimately the benefit of that really applies on the or depends on the actions that are resulting from that once the results come in. I'll just pop up to the chats. I know that we've just got a couple of people here. One of the comments here, you know, the board asking for benchmarking so they can understand how our organisation compares with others in our industry. I think it's a really, really healthy question to ask, and really, you know, very encouraging if you're having boards asking that questions, because those questions, because it means they're, you know, they're sort of open to change and able to sort of agitate for change in an organisation. We have someone else, Courtney Smith. Good to know how others are doing so you can better understand how to improve, especially if you're stuck. That's another great comment as well. I think, you know, often, you know, we work in organisations and, you know, we're stuck in a little bit of a rut, and you want to understand what you need to do to overcome that rut, to improve. And it's, I think also it sometimes serves to validate what you're doing to see if you're actually on the right track with things as well. So, you know, a couple of great comments there. Thank you very much for that. Just moving on to on from that definition of I'm one who likes models to an extent. So just bear with me on this for a moment. But I do like Kotter's 8 steps to change, and many of you again will have seen something or used something very similar to this in your careers, I'm sure. But the bit that I like about it, and I'm a bit of a sort of a systematic person, is you know, I think it's very logical, the progression to, you know, creating a sense of urgency to embedding change. But this model got me thinking a little bit about benchmarking and why we benchmark. And I think Luke talked before about you know, change and so on. And I think whenever you want to have a change, you need to create that climate for change. And a good way to create that climate for change is to benchmark, because it gives you an objective view on what's happening elsewhere. So that if you're presenting information to the board around benchmarking, obviously it needs to stand up to scrutiny, and there needs to be objectivity in it. But once you do it, you start to set the wheels in motion in terms of you know, why aren't we doing this, and what do we need to do better to close this gap on our competitors or around this process or metric. So I think benchmarking can be a very important tool to frame a conversation with boards or management around the need for change. Often internal data is good and important as well, but I think it's very, very powerful having a look at what other organisations are doing. In my experience, I think you know, boards do like to see you know, that benchmarking across other organisations to give them a sense of where the organisation sits that they direct. Luke, just we've heard a little bit about you in terms of you know, your history with benchmarking and the like. Has benchmarking in your career been used for change in any particular way? Is there any examples you might be able to give us?
Yeah, probably more recently than anything else. You know, I think you know, with the introduction of psychosocial risk in the WHS legislation, you know, there's, I guess it's quite in its infancy. And again, we used the Health and Safety Index to really inform us around what are the key risk areas from a psychosocial risk area that we should be focusing on, and also benchmarking that. Now, you know, if I throw out our number did come below the benchmark, so that's a really good point of discussion with our board and the executive leadership team around, you know, creating that sort of case for change and case to move things forward. So, you know, I'll pick on one little example, which is work demand and some of the outcomes that we got from that. So as a direct result of that benchmarking activity. So, you know, we had some fairly low scores in work demand and job demand, workload as a result. And even through, and I think another real rich piece of information is the verbatim that people provide in those surveys. But comparing that from a benchmarking perspective is a bit difficult, but the questions themselves does provide that insight. Having that in the back pocket with an executive or a board and that data to actually show, you know what, here's where we are, here's where, you know, the rest of the industry is, you know, we've got a gap to close here, is really powerful. And what we did as a result, on this work demand piece is just within our health and safety strategy, we actually paused items. So as part of that, there was a far cry from our business saying, there's too much going on. We need to slow down a few things. And presented that to the executive leadership team. We got endorsement there, and then further on we went to the board and got endorsement to actually rejig some of our strategies so that there wasn't that burden and that workload pressure on the business. So there's a really very recent example of how we've used benchmarking to effectively address one of our psychosocial risks and actually make that change. So still a lot more work to do, but that's just one little example.
Oh, that's a really good example, and it sounds like you're able to achieve quite a bit on the back of that that benchmarking. It leads into another area as well, and I think that's before you embark on benchmarking, it's really important to know where you want to play, just to use a colloquialism, because benchmarking can be very, very wide, extremely wide, and you can get lost in it. There's that many things that you can benchmark against. So from a board perspective or a senior management perspective, Luke, was there ever a discussion in terms of where and what you'd like to benchmark against? We talked about psychosocial. I suppose that's a risk area that was pertinent at the time. Any other insights?
Yeah, so it came, and I'm very lucky that APA, we've got a very progressive board. So there's a lot of conversation. We've got a safety and sustainability committee or subcommittee to the board. So, the big driver from them was they wanted to understand where we sat. What was our maturity from a cultural perspective? So, a lot of it was around the culture for HSE health and safety across the business. So that was one of their key insights. In the background we had the psychosocial risk piece, gaining momentum as well. So, as part of that, through that engagement, we looked at a number of options. In terms of you asked the question, where do we want to play? Well, we want to be, our strategy and vision was to be world class. So we've got a long way to go. So what we need to do is understand, well, where do we sit now? And the only way to really do that is to look at it from a benchmarking perspective. So, and where do we compare to other organisations? And I think the culture aspect, particularly from the board, is something that they were really keen and interested in. And I know there's a number of different models out there. We looked at a number. We went with the health and safety index just because of the flexibility and what that provided for us. And that's given me and given us, a bit of a platform to go, right, well, here's where we are and here's where we want to be. So what are the improvement activities we need to address? And to your point before, it did validate a lot of the work that we were already doing. So validated a lot of the initiatives that we had in place and we had approved for our strategy. However, it did identify some real good key learnings and opportunities for improvement. So, I think it had the desired effect. But yeah, I think it is very important that the board is on board and the executive team is on board. I've been, in previous organisations where the focus is, again, probably in the wrong areas, and they do probably focus too much on that quantitative approach and, where do we sit? But I think, having a board that's really focused on, they want that qualitative data and they want to, test themselves against, the best organisations out there as well to see where they're at, I think is really, really positive.
Yeah, look, I don't think you can sort of overstate the importance of, use the phrase again, determining where you want to play. And the reason for that is, organisations are all time poor and resource constrained to various extents. So you don't want to be benchmarking in the wrong areas or against the wrong organisations. And Luke raises a very important point there. If you want to be world class in what you're doing, that's going to take some time, but you want to benchmark against the right organisations. You don't want to benchmark against organisations or industries perhaps that aren't quite as progressive. Otherwise, you'll be wasting your effort. So that's a very important conversation to have with senior management or the board. But it's also a bit of an educational piece as well, because if you do have an organisation that's sometimes stuck on lagging indicators that are quantitative, and suddenly they realise that to shift the dial, there's a whole new world out there in terms of surveys and different means by which to benchmark. it can be quite empowering, I think, in terms of where the organisation goes and shifting that conversation away from, we might have a triffer of one, but we still manage to kill somebody every 3 years. Those sort of conversations, so very, very powerful. Just moving on from there in terms of the how. This is a bit of a simplistic model, but and I think we've touched on a couple of points here which are very important, which help define the approach, and that's the where do you want to play. The other one is how do you access reliable data. There's a degree of objectivity that's needed to base decision making on, so that's a very important consideration. And also how to access partners, and this also ties into where you want to play and where you want to be as an organisation. You certainly don't benchmark for the fun of it. I think we've broadly spoken about it's very useful in terms of validating direction and initiatives, but also understanding objectively where you might sit relative to peers and different cohorts. I'm interested, and I might just throw to the group chat if I can, for some feedback from the participants on the group. But if you've benchmarked before, what particular area have you benchmarked? Has it been a process? Has it been a metric as such? I'm just interested in some insights from the group, if that's possible. I might, if you don't mind having a look at that, I'll come back to that once we get some feedback there. So defining the approach, I think the next piece is deployment, and you start to get a sense that this is if you're going to do it in a very structured fashion, because it's going to senior management or the board, you do need to be systematic about it. The way you collect data is important. Is it opinion based, or is it factual in terms of objective data? The way you're going to analyse the data. Establish goals, actions that arise from the comparisons that you may draw between organisations, and that then starts to get into the important piece around ownership and implementation, which does sort of talk to accountability and a little bit of change management as well. Ultimately, if you're going to shift the dial, it might need the organisation to be configured a little bit differently, or it might be a lot simpler than that. So there's a thought process that one needs to go through with the deployment phase. Reviewing ties into learning, sharing, of course, as well, across partners or focus groups. And it's interesting because the partnership between one organisation and another can be mutually beneficial. There might be some aspects, and I think this is the importance of picking the right partner to benchmark against. There might be something you can glean out of the relationship with your organisation, and likewise, there's a learning opportunity with another organisation within or outside the industry. And I think you miss a trick really with anything in workplace health and safety if you're not setting out objectives and checking how you're tracking against those objectives. Ultimately, we just recently talked about where you play. And if it is that your organisation says, look, in 5 years' time, we want to be world-class in this particular aspect, well, I think you've got part of your answer there in terms of what your objectives are, and they can be incremental each year. Following the review piece, there's the improvement piece, and all of this is for zero unless there's some improvement that comes out the back end of it. So fairly obvious, I suppose, but you want to be able to measure that improvement has happened. And I'd just like to call out as well that on the back of this session as well, FEFO, the organisation for which I work for, is would be very happy to facilitate some groups for those who are interested in benchmarking. And we do have a poll and a quiz coming up shortly if you are interested in that. And the areas that we can help in assisting with the approach and partnering different organisations together, but also the review aspects there as well in terms of learning and review. We can certainly play a role there in helping support that conversation. The deployment and the improvement, if you like, arguably the heavy lifting, they sit internally within your own organisations, because you'll have people and organisational aspects that need to be improved there. Just moving on, just one in the chat here. Catherine, thanks for responding there. Our organisation is looking at quantitative benchmarking, so accident and injury rates, and I don't think there's one particular measure that gives the whole picture, and certainly injury rates or accident rates, provide a level of insight. So, that's interesting. Thank you for that, Catherine. Just moving on from that now, wanted to touch on what makes a good KPI. And I used the phrase earlier, not all metrics were created equal. And some of you may have seen a diagram similar to this, which I think there's been quite a bit of work done by might be the University of Colorado or the Construction Safety Research Alliance, in particular, Professor Matt Hallowell. But it resonates with me, and I know it resonates with a lot of other of my peers within the industry as well. And there's various aspects that make a good KPI, not one. And they talk about balanced KPIs. As you can see up the top there, there's an element around being evidence-based, predictive, valid, reliable, and then opinion-based, important, functional, and clear. And just expanding on that a little bit further, predictive as an interesting measure, and not all measures are predictive, are they? I think accident or injury rates are certainly valid and objective, because there's been something you can measure, but they might not always provide the best insight. They certainly do, provide a purpose. But there are some measures that are predictive. Validity, is it statistically meaningful? I think that's a very important aspect of what you do in terms of benchmarking. Reliability as well. So, there's various aspects, and I think we all know statistics is a science, on its own. Are the results or is the content repeatable? Is it statistically reliable, such as Luke mentioned earlier, the Health and Safety Index, which I'll speak to shortly. Is it important? Does it reflect the outcome? Is it functional? Can it be used to inform operational or strategic risk? Excuse me, just got something popped up there. And is it understood? Is it clear? Is it easily communicated, and the like? I think that's important as well. Something that we use as an organisation, and there's different techniques and methods and models out there, but we use what we call the Health and Safety Index. To us, statistical reliability is very, very important. And I think Luke touched on something very, very important before as well. And while an index or a cultural survey certainly gives a result at the other end, the actual act of engaging with the workforce on the state of the nation, if you like, can't be underplayed. And you need to really maximise on that in terms of providing feedback. But I think some of the gold that comes out of an index or a cultural survey sometimes are the free text responses and the insights that you can have in your back pocket. So if you are challenged on a particular aspect of benchmarking, you can provide some context or colour to that. Focus areas are important, and this ties into where do we play? You want a return on investment. You're not sort of doing this for the fun of it. There needs to be an organisational improvement that comes out the other end. So I guess you start to see that you build the picture here that you do need an element of top-down sponsorship or engagement, if you like. You are talking about buy-in from the senior management in terms of where you might want to benchmark, because ultimately they're going to ask the question in terms of how you went, how are we tracking against that benchmarking exercise, and what's it driving, because they've got an obligation, obviously, to report back to their stakeholders. Measuring what matters. Not all metrics were created equal. There's many that are balanced, and wouldn't mind just throwing to the group. Has anybody got any benchmarking metrics or metrics that they feel are quite balanced in terms of what they cover? They're clear, they're objective, they're statistically reliable, insightful. Any thoughts on that? Maybe there's none, maybe there's some, but look, I think in safety, as you well know, I think it's very easy, and many of us are conditioned to find conditions that need improvement. We're not conditioned as well to celebrate success and reinforce the good thing that happened. And I think it's no different to benchmarking or taking a survey where we do identify opportunities and outcomes are evident. We need to reinforce the good that happens. So look, on that note, I wouldn't mind running the next poll, and that is in your organisation. I think we've heard from people that roughly a bit over half of benchmarked before. Would you be interested in participating in facilitated benchmarking focus group calls with like-minded organisations or partners? So this is the opportunity to pair with another organisation who might meet your strategic needs in terms of where you'd like to head as an organisation, because it's something that we'll be able to help in terms of facilitation. So I'll just let people respond to that piece. And further to that, Sarah's just posted a link in the chat as well. So if you are interested, and hopefully some of you are, because I think it's very beneficial, you can log your details there and be in touch with you after the call to help facilitate that process.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I'm just going to no, I'm not going to end it yet because people are still responding. Okay. There is a bit of interest, yeah, in having that poll. So yes, I have put the form up in the chat as well. And if you do want to join that, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always good to have a bit of a helping hand, and it's something that it might be interesting to visit again later in the year, Sarah, just to see how people are progressing with that, because I think we all sort of interested in sustainable outcomes, and we wanted to drive improvement for like-minded organisations. Luke, I might just turn to you again just for another question, and that is, look, industry-wise, you benchmarked before. That's obvious. Is APA itself involved in any sort of peer or industry benchmarking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll use an example. We're actually part of the National Road Safety Partnership Program. So it's run by Monash University. It's a utilities forum. So, likes of Telstra, Optus, Origin. There's a number of organisations that are part that do form part of that group. The group initially was set up to, discuss improvements, particularly around driving. Driving is one of our biggest risks. We do over 16 million kilometres a year on the road with our people. So one of our key risks. So that we have just started a piece of work to sort of determine what we want to benchmark as a group. And we're actually having more organisations join that as we speak. So look, I think it's a really good example of industry getting together, working on a common area, a common risk area in terms of driving, and what we want to do is actually set some key actual numbers. So what are those metrics that we actually want to measure against and use as our sort of key performance indicators? The benefit of that will be that we're all going to set those key performance indicators together. So it's not going to be, comparing through board reports or whatnot. We're actually going to be collecting that data centrally through the Monash University and be able to report on it. So from a statistically relevant perspective, it's going to be quite clear around what the definitions are, what the metrics are, and how we all apply those. So we're going to get that consistency in definition, consistency in data capture as well. So look, that's probably a really recent example, and we're still going through that process at the moment to establish that and data capture. So look, I would love, and if there's anyone on the call, reach out after. I think there's a big gap in the safety industry, and for those who haven't read the Brady report that came out from the Queensland fatalities, it really did identify that there is a gap, particularly around the serious injury fatality risk metric that you don't see in board reports. I think some organisations do report it, but there's no consistency around that. So I think that's an area that, you know, we can start sort of moving away. You know, I'm not suggesting we throw TRIFA away, but, you know, we start moving away from those sort of low consequence, you know, high frequency events to the high potential events, those types of things. And it would be great to, you know, to sort of leverage that and move down the benchmarking space there. But yeah, no, look, I think there's certainly appetite, you know, within I know there's appetite within the safety community and within businesses as well. So yeah, look, I think there's plenty of work to do.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And I know throughout my career, I think in the early days I used whatever I could find, you know, whatever was discoverable, and often it was annual reports, and often it was TRIFA that was benchmarkable or critical risk or cardinal rules. It might have been just in terms of themes or where risk issues were. I think things have moved on since then, and it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative measures, I think, that are on offer for us, and it partly depends on where you want to play. I just like to recap a couple of things and then close out the conversation and such. So look, today the objective was just to give you a bit of an overview in terms of you know, how to benchmark and what it comprises. We've looked at the who and the what. We've looked at the why. You know, there's different reasons why people might want to benchmark. We've had a look at also at a model in terms of the how. So there's, you know, a sequence of things that need to happen, and ultimately you're dealing with people here. It's not just numbers and figures and surveys. There's people and there's buy-in needed to secure change. So I think sometimes a change framework is a good framework to use in terms of affecting that change. And we've also looked at or talked a little bit about reliability as well. And as Luke suggested there, you know, high potential incidents is certainly something there's a lot of interest in terms of you know, a potential benchmarking metric. Look, in terms of next steps for yourselves, whether or not you decide you'd like to participate in some facilitated sessions, do you have a need to change? I guess is the first question to ask yourself and your managers. And that can be framed in different ways. I think we heard from somebody through the chat that things were sort of steady state. And I guess that's never a good thing in safety, is that you want that sort of chronic unease. You want people to be a bit uneasy about what's happening and always looking for the next thing they can do to drive improvement and change. I think the next question is the what. So do you have the most relevant benchmarking? And that sort of follows on from the question of where you want to play, because that's partly going to dictate who and how you partner with people and what you actually observe, which leads on to the partnering piece there, a reliable benchmarking partner and reliable data, which is you know, something that FEFO is very happy to be involved in. Just from a facilitation perspective, I think it'd be really beneficial to be involved in that for everybody. And then finally, you know, how is this going to work in terms of approach, deployment? How are you going to review that it's effective? And what are the improvements that come out the other end? Because somebody's going to be asking the question. We've been through this exercise. We've benchmarked with people. You've told us that we need to focus on these areas. We're expecting a material change in some of our performance that we report. So that's it's very important to be mindful of that and have an eye on the prize with that particular aspect as well. Look, from my perspective, I don't have anything further to add to the session. Sarah, I might hand back over to you, if that's okay.
Thank you, Adam. I have asked people to drop questions in the Q&A. I don't think there are any at this stage, but the feedback is really good. So yeah, well, we'll leave that there. We'll send out recording later today. I think it was really relevant. Jenny said, yep, interesting presentation. So we've got the link, the forms in there, if anyone wants to, interested in joining that focus group. And Adam, of course, if that all goes ahead, we have to have a webinar panelist type thing about, you know, the result of all of that. So thank you, Luke, as well. So yeah, have a good rest of your week, everyone, and stay tuned for the links later on in your email. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.